Picture this. You are 8 years old. You're sitting in your classroom when a police officer walks in, not to scare you, but to help. He rolls your fingers one by one across an ink pad and presses each fingerprint carefully onto a little card. Then he places a photo of your face next to those prints. This card is for your parents, he explains, so that if something happens to you, if you go missing, they can give it to the police. You were 8 years old. You did not fully understand what "if something happens to you" meant. And then school let out, and you walked home alone, let yourself into an empty house, and waited for someone to come back. My name is Frank, and that razor-sharp contradiction you just sat in is the thing nobody has ever properly explained about what it meant to be younger Gen X. If you were born between 1973 and 1980, you grew up during one of the biggest shifts in American family life that had ever happened. According to multiple verified studies and the National Center for Education Statistics, the number of mothers in the workforce doubled between 1969 and 1996. Double. Over that same period, from 1960 to 1980, the divorce rate in the United States more than doubled as well. The result was that about 40% of Gen X kids became latchkey kids, coming home from school to empty houses, a key strung around their necks, heating up microwave dinners, shouldering more responsibility than their years ever warranted. 40%. That is not a small group. That is nearly half a generation. And here's the thing that gets lost when people talk about this. It was not just the older Gen Xers. The latchkey experience hit younger Gen X, the ones born in the mid to late 1970s, just as hard, maybe harder. Because by the time you were in elementary school in the early to mid-1980s, this was simply how it was. It was not unusual. It was Tuesday. A 2004 marketing study described your generation as having gone through its most important formative years as one of the least parented, least nurtured generations in American history. A 1984 documentary about the situation called you daytime orphans. Not because your parents didn't love you, but because for a few hours every afternoon, you were on your own. You made the food, you did the homework, or did not. You handled whatever came up, and nobody was there to watch. Research on latchkey children is pretty consistent on what those hours felt like for the youngest ones. Loneliness, boredom, and fear. Not rebellion, not wild behavior. Loneliness, boredom, and fear. Think about what that actually means. You are 7 or maybe 9. You walk into a house that is quiet. Not peaceful quiet, just quiet. The TV goes on immediately, not because you want to watch anything in particular, but because the sound makes it feel like somebody else is there. You make yourself something to eat, maybe cereal again, maybe you heat something up. You'll figure it out. And here's the part that never gets talked about enough. By middle school, many Gen X kids were already responsible for babysitting younger siblings, cooking meals, changing diapers, handling things most modern parents would not dream of letting a preteen manage. You were 12 years old managing a household, deciding what your little brother ate for dinner, making sure homework got done, yours and someone else's. And when your parent finally walked through the door at 6 or 7 in the evening, your answer to "How was your day?" was "Fine." Because what were you going to say? You might be thinking, okay, but kids adapt, kids are resilient, and that's true. But here's what makes your specific experience different from any other unsupervised childhood in American history. You were alone at the exact same moment the whole country decided children were in mortal danger. Here's the sequence of events, all verified, all real. In 1979, 6-year-old Etan Patz disappeared in New York City while walking to the school bus stop. He was never found. In 1981, Adam Walsh was left momentarily at a Sears department store in Florida while his mother stepped away to buy a lamp. She was gone less than 10 minutes. 2 weeks later, his head was found in a drainage canal. In October 1983, a TV movie about Adam Walsh aired on ABC. Between 38 and 50 million people watched it. It ended with President Reagan on screen, photos of 54 missing children behind him, saying, "Maybe your eyes can bring them home." In September 1984, dairies began printing photographs of missing children on milk cartons. Within months, the practice spread nationwide. In total, some 700 dairies participated, producing approximately 3 billion milk cartons, each adorned with the face of a missing child. You had breakfast with those faces every single morning: cereal, toast, orange juice, and a reminder that children went missing and sometimes were never found. Your school held assemblies. There were pamphlets, videos, board games called Strangers and Dangers. PSAs featured McGruff the crime dog. Police departments advised parents to have their children fingerprinted so they could identify the bodies later. And if you were born between 1973 and 1980, you were between 4 and 11 years old during the stranger danger panic at its absolute peak, from 1981 to 1985. You were in your most impressionable childhood years, the age when fears get wired in, the age when the world forms the shape of your mind. The fear got in. It was built in. And then, at 3 o'clock, you walked home alone. That is not a small thing. That is being told every morning at breakfast that children disappear, and then being expected to manage yourself for 3 hours every afternoon with nobody home. Your generation absorbed the message that the world was full of predators, and then your generation was left to navigate that world alone every single weekday for most of your childhood. Fast forward. The latchkey years are mostly behind you. You're a teenager, and the news is still all fear. If you were born in 1973, you were 15 when the crack epidemic was at its worst. Between 1984 and 1989, the homicide rate for black males aged 14 to 17 doubled in the United States. That was not a statistic. That was the news every night. That was the neighborhoods around you, the neighborhoods your school friends came from. The crack epidemic changed the sound and feel of American cities during your teenage years in a way that people who were not there often do not fully understand. And at the same time, you were being taught something in sex ed that no generation before you had ever been taught in school. Sex could kill you. The AIDS epidemic loomed over the formative years of Generation X as much as the threat of nuclear attack. Your school rewrote the sex education curriculum. The message was direct. This disease existed, it spread, people died, and you needed to know. The HIV and AIDS crisis sparked the safe sex movement and shaped a generation's understanding of health and mortality. If you were born in 1976, you were 18 in 1994 when Pedro Zamora, a young man with AIDS, appeared on The Real World, San Francisco, on MTV. You watched him live openly with the disease, form relationships, and decline. He died that same year at 22. President Bill Clinton publicly praised him for his work educating the public. You were watching this as a child. You were watching it as a teenager, figuring out who you were and what the world was. And what you saw was this. The world is complicated, people die, institutions are slow, and you are mostly going to have to figure this out yourself. That was not a new lesson for you. It was just a bigger version of the one that started at 3 o'clock every afternoon in 2nd grade. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Take everything you just heard, the empty house at 3 o'clock, the milk carton faces at breakfast, the fingerprinting at school, the AIDS messaging as a teenager, the crack epidemic as background noise to your high school years. Take all of that and ask, what would a child who grew up in that environment do when they had their own kids? When Gen Xers became parents, the pendulum swung hard to the other extreme. Overparenting. Anxious vigilance about their children's safety, often erring on the side of overprotection, of not letting their kids handle stressors or challenging situations alone. You became the helicopter parents who tracked their kids' location on their phones, the ones who were at every pickup, every drop-off. The ones who could not stomach the idea of their kids feeling that same loneliness. And here's the thing that makes this funny in a very dark way. People younger than you make fun of helicopter parents constantly. They describe hovering, anxious adults who will not let their kids do anything alone. And technically, they are right, but they have no idea why. You were told the world was the most dangerous place imaginable for a child, and then you were left alone in it every afternoon for years. You swore, consciously or not, that your kids would never feel that particular kind of alone. One person on social media put it simply: an overprotective parent was an unprotected child. That is not a pithy quote. That is a description of cause and effect. You experienced something that left a mark, and you responded to that mark the way people work. Here's the honest summary of what your childhood made you. You grew up being told danger was everywhere, and you were left to handle it alone. You learned to make decisions without anyone watching. You figured out how to take care of other people before you were old enough to properly take care of yourself. You sat with loneliness in a quiet house and got through it. You watched institutions fail, and you developed a healthy skepticism of anything that sounded too official or too certain. Gen Xers are typically described as resourceful and independent, traits partly stemming from their latchkey childhoods, as well as keen on maintaining work-life balance, perhaps due to witnessing the demands of their parents' work and the subsequent absence from family life. That's the polished version. The real version is you figured out that you were mostly going to have to do things yourself, and you got pretty good at it. And you did something else too, something quieter. You paid attention to what you didn't want to repeat. The parents who were too absent, you tried to show up differently. The world that felt terrifying and out of control, you tried to give your kids something more stable. You overcorrected in some ways, like every generation does, but the impulse was real. You were called the least parented generation in American history. You turned around and decided you were going to parent differently. That's not nothing. That's the whole thing. Share your experiences growing up as a younger Gen X in the comments below. If this video resonated with you, hit like and subscribe, and check out the other videos on screen right now. I'll see you there.